So in 1930, Laura Gilpin and her partner, Betsy Forrester, were driving through Navajo lands when their car broke down. And they didn't know where they were, and they were sort of stranded in the middle of a place that didn't have a lot of amenities, so Forrester stayed with the car, and Gilpin walked to go find help. When she came back, she describes, hours later, that Betsy was sitting in the car surrounded by Diné, or Navajo people. Diné is what they call themselves, who were chatting with her and keeping her company and trying to help, even though they didn't all speak the same language. That experience was really powerful for both those women, so much so that Betsy ended up coming back to Navajo lands and being a field nurse there for a couple of years. After that, the women continued to visit, especially Gilpin, for the next 40 years, basically, forming lifelong friendships with Navajo people. Of course, Gilpin was a white woman. She would always be an outsider in some way, but she basically became as much an insider as she could through genuine relationships and friendships with many of these people. Gilpin's photographs in the 30s were much more classical. They were posed often as formal portraits like these two here. She had a more pictorial sense at that time in her life. The women weren't able to spend a lot of time visiting during the war years, which were disruptive to everything, of course. But then you can see the people that she photographed before the war, she actually went back and photographed again later. This is the same family in 1950. The story of what had happened in the interim is very sad, though. Francis and his wife, who Laura never learned the name of because they didn't speak the same language. Francis and his wife had lost one of their children in the war. He was a soldier. He went to Europe and died on the battlefield there. And in this photograph, the flag that hangs behind them is the flag that draped his coffin. The other thing that had happened in the interim was that Gilpin's approach to photography had changed, and her ideas of what this was going to be had changed. So while those earlier portraits and photographs were still and beautiful and pictorial and often had a slightly romantic or fuzzy look to them, when she came back after the war, she knew that she wanted to do a long-term project book, which is what it became, and started to focus more on the Diné people and their relationship to the US. So of course, the Navajo Nation is a sovereign nation within the bounds of the United States and has many ways in which it interacts with that mainstream US culture. Gilpin ended up being very interested in the ways that these interactions happened, and especially focused her photographs on examples of economics, self-governance, trade, and the ways in which the Navajo people adapted to living as a sovereign people within a larger nation. She ended up calling her final project the Enduring Navajo. At the time, a lot of Americans understood the Navajo as a people that had existed, but they were often relegated to the past, and depictions of them, whether on mainstream media or in some caricatured way, often emphasized 19th century Native peoples. But Gilpin was interested in the people, as she said, as a people who endured, the ways that they adapted and the ways that they didn't to mainstream US culture. I think there's also a way in which Gilpin, as a relatively out lesbian for her time, identified with the Navajo as a fellow people who were also marginalized. She, of course, had the privilege of being white in the United States, but as a woman, she couldn't vote until she was almost 30 when women gained suffrage. And she was denied certain job opportunities and other sort of subtle ways of discrimination throughout her life. So the way this wall is organized, there are sort of smaller subsections of all these different themes she explored. Here is basically a small section about the United States government. We see here a courtroom at the bottom with actually a portrait of George Washington on the back wall. Here is some Navajo women voting in an election. Navajo people didn't actually have one main hierarchical leader until they started to interact with the United States government more and needed one person who could speak on behalf of the entire nation. So that's partly, that led to things like elections of a tribal leader. Then there's a large section on economics. So here we see women at home filling little vials with sand to sell to tourists who travel through the Navajo Nation. And here is a major economic source that continued. Navajo were historically sheep herders and shepherds, and continued that with the freedom to have undeveloped land, as you see in this photograph. But as I said, Gilpin also really looked to the ways that Navajo people were adapting to the culture and the economy around them, the way that we all do whenever the markets change or new technologies become available. Here's a section where you see that. We have a woman who is a typist as her profession. There's a uranium worker down here. Over here is a Navajo student who's studying chemical and electrical engineering at the university. And this man is the leader of a trade organization, the first Navajo to lead that trade organization, and sells goods to tourists and to his own people. And then this last group of 3 photographs, I wanted to portray a couple different ways that the Diné people interacted and understood the land around them. Here we see a sacred mountain on their ancestral homelands. Here we see a Navajo hogan, which is one of the architectural forms they use domestically. And up here we see oil. Once the Navajo had discovered oil on their land, it was a whole new revenue source and another complicated element of their interaction with mainstream US economy and society.